Hey everybody, Jeff Ariema here. I read something recently that got me thinking about the idea of prompt as policy, and I'm trying to connect that to the notion of a context graph, which I've talked about on this channel before. A research paper called HANDBOOK.md gives us a pretty compelling example of the problem they're meant to solve, because it tests what happens when you give an agent a company handbook and expect it to follow that handbook while doing actual work. The researchers created 10 fictional companies across industries, including finance, healthcare, insurance, logistics, human resources, and so forth. Each company had its own policy handbook, ranging from about, say, 20 pages to more than 100. The agents then had to complete realistic tasks using tools for email, Slack, calendars, Jira, Shopify, and other business systems. These were fairly involved tasks, multi-step. An average run required around 30 tool calls, and the agent might need to consult several different systems before deciding what to do. Across the benchmark, there were 65 tasks and 82 available tools, so this is much closer to the shape of enterprise work than a simple kind of question and answer test. The grading seemed pretty strict by my estimation. Completing most of the tasks was not enough. The agent had to satisfy every requirement and avoid every prohibited action. Under that standard, the best performing model configuration succeeded about 36.2% of the time. Most of the frontier model configurations tested came in below 25%. Here's one thing I found interesting in the results. If the researchers allowed each agent to fail a single grading criterion, the success rates for the leading models roughly doubled. You could interpret that as evidence that the agents are getting close. In many cases, they probably are, but that one missed criterion could be, in a real-world situation, the very thing that makes the rest of the action safe. There's no way to know. And the failure modes are fairly unsurprising for those familiar with LLM characteristics. Sometimes the immediate request from the user displaced the standing policy in the handbook, right? That sort of recency bias that we see. In other cases, the agent performed the required check, received a result that should have stopped the process, but continued anyway. Other agents skipped verification, assumed a condition had been satisfied, and then confidently reported that the task had been completed in accordance with policy. Yikes. The paper describes this as a benchmark for long context agentic instruction following, which is exactly what it is. I think it also exposes an architectural principle that we should all be thinking deeply about. So remember this: you can't prompt your way into policy. When you put access control into a prompt, you're relying on the model to find the relevant rule, interpret it, associate it with the current situation, remember it, quote unquote, using several tools, and then honor it when the immediate request may be pushing in another direction. That whole process remains probabilistic. Giving the model more time to reason doesn't necessarily fix it either. More reasoning can also create more opportunities to reinterpret the policy or rationalize an exception, right? You're extending the amount of context in your window. So what's the alternative? Well, I want that rule, any rule that's kind of in bounds here, to exist somewhere with actual authority. I don't want its enforcement to depend entirely on whether the model, quote unquote, remembers the right paragraph at tool call number 27. You also want to spend your tokens on reasoning, not compliance. The model's intelligence is valuable when the task involves ambiguity, planning, and judgment. Repeatedly asking it to reconstruct an authorization system from prose consumes context and compute while still producing inconsistent results. That's a bad cost-benefit ratio. This is where I think a so-called context graph becomes important. A context graph gives an agent a governed model of the organization's data, capabilities, identities, and relationships. The controls can be evaluated when the agent accesses a field or attempts an operation. The policy becomes part of the path through which the agent reads and acts upon the business domain. Imagine, for example, a company policy that permits an agent to issue refunds below $500, while Larger refunds require, say, manager approval. In the handbook as policy approach, the model needs to retrieve that rule, inspect the order, compare the amount, look for an approval, interpret the result, and remember that the refund tool is constrained by all of those facts. At the tool boundary, the refund operation can evaluate those conditions directly and deterministically. It knows the order amount, identity of the caller, and because of that, it can check whether a valid approval exists and whether the order is currently eligible for a refund. If those conditions are not satisfied, in total, the operation is rejected. The agent can still propose the refund, explain why it thinks the refund is appropriate, or ask a manager for approval. It simply cannot reason its way around the control, because again, this is being done outside the model's probabilistic surface area. This is deterministic policy. There are several kinds of control involved here. Field level authorization governs which pieces of data are available to the agent. The agent does not have permission to read, say, a customer's social security number. That value never needs to enter the model's context. Operation level authorization determines which actions the agent can invoke. Preconditions can connect those actions to approvals, account state, transaction limits, or other workflow requirements. The relationships in the graph matter as well. The policy might depend on which organization the user belongs to, whether they manage the account, which region the customer's in, or whether the agent is acting on behalf of a particular employee. Those relationships are already part of the context the agent needs to do its job. The graph gives us a place to express those relationships concretely as part of a strongly typed system. Centralization becomes especially important when you consider that the benchmark exposes 82 different tools. Implementing fragments of the same policy independently across dozens of MCP tools creates plenty of room for drift. A context graph, such as I can imagine it, can provide a governed access layer shared by those tools so that the identity, scope, and business rules have consistent meaning across the agent's environment. There are limits to this argument, though. A context graph cannot translate every sentence in a 100-page handbook into a field-level authorization rule. Some policies require human judgment. Others span several steps and may need a workflow engine, approval service, or controls inside the underlying systems. Enforcement also depends on the graph being an authoritative access path. If the agent has another tool that can modify the database directly, the control can be easily bypassed. But the use case is still compelling, in my opinion. Access rules, sensitive fields, valid operations, transaction limits, approval requirements, scope boundaries, those are exactly the kinds of policies that should survive prompt changes, model upgrades, context compression, and a user asking the agent very nicely or demanding it rudely to make an exception. That's the larger lesson I take from this paper. Better models will improve benchmark results incrementally. Better prompting will probably help as well, but the rules that determine what an agent is actually allowed to see and do deserve a stronger foundation than probabilistic instruction following. We don't need a faster horse. We need a car. Have you been burned by prompt as policy? What adjustments did you have to make? Drop a comment and let us know, and hit that like button while you're there. That's it for now. See you next time.